Okay, so I think we can get started. My name is Elizabeth Pendergrass, and I'd like to welcome all of you to part 1 of our webinar series, Agile Estimation Beyond the Myths. And although this is a 2-part series, both webinars can be viewed independently or together. And I'd also like to announce that today's webinar is PDU approved, and Andy will share the code at the end of today's webinar. I'd also like to announce I'd also like to make you aware of a few technical items. All of you who are listening on the conference call are currently on mute. So to ask a question at any point during the presentation, just use the Q&A dialog box on the right-hand side of the WebEx screen. Andy will field as many of these questions as he has time for at the end of the presentation. If he does not have time to answer your question, don't worry. He will respond to all of these via email. And he will also provide contact information for any further questions you might have after the presentation. So I'll start by quickly introducing our presenter today, Andy Berner. Dr. Andy Berner has helped organizations improve their software development processes for over 20 years. He has hands-on experience with almost every role in software development. He is on the QSM software development team and is leading the work at QSM to incorporate Agile techniques into and enhance the resource demand management capabilities of the SLIM suite. He has recently published several articles on Agile methods and practices, focusing on planning projects to set realistic expectations. He has spoken at numerous conferences on software tools and methods, often with an emphasis on how to make sure that tools serve the team rather than the other way around. He has an A.B. cum laude in mathematics from Harvard University, a PhD in mathematics from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and has 7 U.S. patents. So without further ado, I'll let Andy get started.
Thanks very much, Elizabeth, and welcome, everybody. For several years now at QSM, we've been watching the evolution of Agile methods, and we've been enhancing our tools and methods to fit with what's new and unique about those Agile methodologies. I'm pleased to spend this time with you today showing some of what we've observed and learned. For our agenda today, for this first part of the 2-part series, we'll start off looking at some key Agile principles. We'll discuss the question of what do we estimate and why is it so important to plan a release in Agile organizations. We'll start looking at configuration of an estimate. We'll be looking at sizing and the shape of the work in particular, and then we'll take your questions. Today's webinar is the first of a 2-part series. So here's a bit of a preview of next month. We'll look at further configuration of estimation, in particular milestones and productivity and effort. We'll look at project control and the tracking of a project as it's ongoing and how to use the plan to control what's happening during the project. We'll look some at historical data collection, and then we'll raise a few topics for future research, but that's for next month. So let's get started with this month's. We'll start by briefly looking at some key principles of Agile methods. I've selected these particular ones because they guide a lot of the thinking about estimation. I'll go over them quickly now, and we'll see their import as we delve into the rest of the topics today and next month. Providing software that brings value to its sponsors and users has been a focus of the Agile Manifesto from the time it was written back in that mountain in Utah years ago. It puts the focus on consumers, not the developers. And there's several key consequences of this. Some of the consequences are making sure that you use value assessment to determine the development order, and also that you do quick delivery. You deliver software quickly as possible, but you really want to make sure that what's delivered can still be consumed. Probably the most famous aspect of Agile methods is that development is done in short, time-boxed sprints or iterations. The key thing here is that the length of each sprint is the same throughout the project. We used to see 6 to 8 week sprints years ago. That changed to 3 or 4 week sprints, and now it's common in projects to see 2 week or even 1 week sprints. Short sprints enable getting frequent feedback. Since the sprints are a fixed length, we can use that to describe the duration. Instead of saying it's a 6-month project, we can say we expect to have 15 sprints. The biggest benefit of Agile methods is probably the ability to deal with change. The phrase that's used is we embrace change. By making many decisions as late as possible, we're making them with the most current information based on changing conditions and what we've learned through the frequent feedback that we get at each sprint. But there's a caution. Don't let the idea that we embrace change be an excuse for not thinking things through carefully. Changing back and forth because we didn't think through decisions carefully at the point we made them just causes unproductive churn in Agile projects, just like in any other kind of project. The technique that most facilitates embracing change is emergent requirements in design. The details of the requirements are considered just in time when the requirements have bubbled up and need to be developed, when we talk about them being ready to develop. Thus, the choices and the details are based on the current thinking. This is probably the biggest change from waterfall methods. There are no big upfront requirements in design phases, no signed-off documents that are then thrown over the wall, as if signed-off documents ever made any difference anyway. The business experts are involved throughout the project. The next principle is that working software is the measure of progress. The stories developed and what's left to do are the measure of progress. That means at the end of each of those short sprints, the software must be whole. It must be working and tested so that we can review and get feedback on the new and enhanced function that was developed during that sprint. The term potentially shippable has sometimes been used to describe the level of quality needed at each sprint, but that term's easily misunderstood. We'll be discussing that more later. Another aspect of this principle is that methodology steps, such as architecture reviewed or test plan completed, maybe those are used in your methods and they may be important steps, but they're not the primary measure of progress. Last in this group is the notion of definition of ready and grooming the backlog. This really has become much more prominent in the last several years. It's a recognition that the quality of the requirements fed to the development team at each sprint is critical to maintain productivity and quality of the developed software. Even though there's no big upfront requirements phase, there's a comparable amount of work needed to elicit the requirements that provide value. If the requirements aren't thought through carefully, don't be surprised if the developed software has limited usefulness. So with these principles in mind, let's see how to adapt estimation techniques to Agile methods. There's been a lot of confusion about what needs to be estimated in an Agile environment. Some Agilists have entire methodologies and techniques for Agile estimation. On the other hand, we've seen discussion asking, do we need to estimate at all in Agile methods? As is often the case, these seemingly opposing sides come mostly from miscommunication. And in particular, in this case, the word estimation means two very different things. In an Agile environment, we have to distinguish between the sprint level and the project release level. At each sprint, there are some decisions to be made. In particular, which specific stories will be developed in the next sprint. This decision process is often referred to as Agile estimation in the literature. In contrast, when deciding whether to charter a project or a software release, you need to estimate the overall cost and duration and to make decisions about the release. In particular, these release-level estimates are needed to choose which projects will provide the best return and to which you should apply the limited resources you have in your organization. This includes trade-offs of scope, cost, and duration. While the techniques may be adjusted because of Agile method, these are the classic questions that require good estimates in order to answer them. Let's look briefly at those sprint-level decisions. Remember, the duration of each sprint in the project will be the same, and sticking to that time box provides a cadence for feedback and adjustment. That cadence is chosen, not estimated. There are several things you have to decide at each sprint. Given the feedback we've received, what should we change and improve on? And then in particular, what's the next set of stories to develop? The team members will get very good at making these short-term decisions. They have the direct knowledge to make them, And while we'll talk a lot about the nonlinearities of software projects as a whole, the things that make release estimation difficult, these nonlinearities don't surface in a short 2-week sprint. People get very good at figuring out on their own what's next. In contrast, when making decisions about release plans, the questions are very different. They're about deciding how to apply limited organizational resources, which projects bring the most value for the cost. Questions like, should we increase cost in order to save time? Or, how long will it take to develop enough valuable features to release? When we talk about estimation at QSM, these release level questions are what we're talking about. To understand this contrast, let's think through a bit more what we mean by release. I'm not going to give you a formal definition, but the release comprises enough new and enhanced functionality to be of value. You can expect it to be delivered and consumed by actual users, to be put into production. It's not just for review purposes, so it has to have enough functionality that it's fully useful, and it has to go through whatever steps are needed to get it into production. It's actually shippable. And that brings us back to the term that's sometimes used, potentially shippable. You may ask, don't we have potentially shippable software ready at each iteration? We chose the highest priority, presumably highest value functionality, to add at each sprint. We tested and we have high quality working software. Doesn't this mean that the software at each sprint is ready to release? Well, no, it doesn't, because remember the purpose of the software at each sprint. It's to see that we've made progress and to get good feedback on that progress and to learn from what we've done. While we're making progress towards a consumable release at each sprint, we've not necessarily gotten there yet. And there's a technical aspect of this that's very important. In order to stick to the time box, we have to choose small enough functionality so that the development of that small functionality can fit in the time box. We may take a bigger piece of functionality that's needed by the users and then break it down into developer-sized bites, small enough to fit into a sprint, and we finish off just those bites within the sprint. So it really was the highest priority that fits in our short time box. This is great because it gives us early feedback and course corrections, but the developer-sized bites added in the sprint may not be enough for the end user. That's okay. The rest of what's needed will be developed in the next or later sprints. You can't arbitrarily put a short time box around the functionality the user needs, so the software developed in any particular sprint is ready to be reviewed, but not necessarily ready to be consumed. A quick note for those of you who are using a methodology called the Scaled Agile Framework, which we're seeing more and more being used. In SAFe version 3, they no longer use the term they originally used, which was potentially shippable increment. Instead, they've renamed that to program increment to avoid that confusion of what potentially shippable means. And the framework added an additional construct for release for the software that is actually shipped, in contrast to the program increment. SAFe recognizes that releases do not have to be ready on the time box boundaries for program increments. An important aspect of the decision to actually ship software is that it must coordinate with other non-software development activities. This could include marketing activities, manufacturing plans, other non-software process changes, among many other things. So you need to anticipate and plan for when you're going to ship a release to coordinate with people responsible for those other activities. Shipping can't always be a last-minute, just-in-time activity. So unlike the short-term decisions that a team can make in each sprint by themselves, people's intuition and expert judgment are not very good at making release-level estimates. Typically, they try to extrapolate from the same way that they would make short-term decisions. You know, it'll take a week to do this, 2 weeks for that, a couple of days for this other thing. But that intuitive bottom-up way of estimating doesn't work over the time scale of a release. It doesn't take into account for the longer-term nonlinearities of software development. Almost nothing in software development scales proportionally. Twice as big doesn't mean it takes twice as long. Twice as many people can't get the same amount done in half the time. We'll be talking in more detail about this, but in addition to extrapolating proportionally, people don't learn well from history. They're wishful thinkers. You've heard this. They say, yeah, I guess it's true that the last few projects really took a little longer, but we'll be better this time. To get a credible estimate that can be used for planning purposes, people need help. The statistical computations and the use of historical data by the slim-sweeten methods take into account those factors that people ignore and help you get credible estimates that can be the basis of plans. You know, there are a few other myths that I sometimes hear in the Agile community. One of them is, in Agile, we decide on schedule, not scope. That's partly a misconception about the time-box nature of a sprint. The sprint is time-boxed arbitrarily, but that doesn't mean the whole project is time-boxed arbitrarily. Of course, sometimes you do have to fit a project into a fixed duration, but this isn't Agile related. There can be many high-minded reasons for this. You have real business deadlines. There's also a tendency to take an estimated duration as a hard and fast commitment. But whether for good reasons or bad, there's no reason to apply that this has to apply to Agile projects any more or less than any other method. Recently, the Agile community has adopted some of the principles of lean development, which emphasizes short releases to avoid the cost of delay. But this still doesn't mean you have to choose an arbitrary time box and try to shoehorn the value into it. Especially with the emphasis Agile methodologies place on value of software, you have to let the business needs and goals drive the trade-offs among scope, schedule, and cost. These trade-offs will be adjusted as conditions change, of course, and Agile methods really provide excellent feedback to help you make those adjustments and embrace those changes. But they are trade-offs nonetheless. I want to say a bit more about these notions coming into Agile methods from lean thinking. A term you'll hear more and more often is minimal viable release. There's often an emphasis on the minimal part. Make the release as short as possible. This does provide some real advantages. I think many of you know that shortening release time often raises the cost of development. But without going into the whole economic argument here, that extra cost can be trumped by the cost of delay, which leads to the idea that it's sometimes said, smaller batch sizes is better. But while keeping releases short and scope small, don't forget the viable part of this. Put out a release that doesn't do enough to be useful, and your users will turn away. And, you know, first impressions are very hard to change. So think of minimal and viable as competing forces to be optimized. So while eliminating gold plating, don't assume that less is always better. I'm a broken record on this. It depends on the business goals and the value that you provide in the eye of the beholder. Just because you've done the most important things at any point doesn't mean that you've done enough. Whether it's a new project or an upgrade, users do not want to change unless there's enough to make that change worthwhile. The user-sized functionality comes in all sizes, not just the developer-sized bytes that can be reviewed in the sprint. So let's look at some of the inputs and outputs that we use when we're doing an estimate of a release. Historical data is very important. Each of the dots on the picture represents a project from history, and we can compare the current project to our projects from history. The size of the functionality that's needed to reach your goals is critical, and we're going to be talking a lot about that in the next section. The shape of the work depends on your methodology, and we'll be seeing some very real differences between Agile methods and emergent requirements than there were in waterfall methods. Your expectations about productivity matter a lot also. On the output side, you get a trade-off between schedule and effort. You get to compare what does it take to shorten the duration, how much more will that cost us in effort to maybe get some better, to avoid some cost of delay. Another key output is risk. It's very tempting to say, you remember I mentioned that often estimates are taken as hard deadlines. That's because people say, I'll be done in 6.5 months. Well, it's really much better to realize that it's 50% likely I'll be done in 6.5 months. And if we're really lucky, we may be able to be done in just over 5 months. But if you really want to be sure that we're going to meet the deadline, you probably ought to plan for 7.5 or 8 months. And the risk curve helps you make that assessment. Another output is the expected dates for key milestones that help you plan and coordinate plans with other organizations. We're going to see in next month's webinar that milestones in an Agile project are treated quite differently from milestones in a waterfall project. So in summary, a release must provide consumable value. Unlike sprints, the project to develop a release can't always be time-boxed. Team members are great at making the sprint-level decisions, but estimating a release requires tools and methods that take several things into account. It takes into account the overall goals and helps you balance minimal with viable. It does a top-down estimate of the release as a whole rather than trying to extrapolate from small chunks. It uses statistical methods that understand the nonlinearities of software development and the organizational-wide or industry-wide historical data. So with that in mind, let's talk about how we actually do some of these estimates. And we'll start with sizing. We'll spend a few minutes looking at how we can do sizing of a release in an Agile environment. That size is a key input to an estimate is something that Agilists understand better, in fact, than most groups that do waterfall development. Many Agile authors have cautioned against trying to guess the duration or effort that a project will take. That's an output of an estimate based on size. How you translate the scope of a project into a measured size depends, naturally enough, on how the scope is defined. Because the scope of projects and the specific requirements of projects can be expressed in a very wide variety of ways, the slim suite of tools is very flexible on how you can express size. In the Agile world, there's actually a bit more uniformity. Scope is generally expressed as a backlog of user stories. That notion, user story, was invented to focus the requirements on the basic purpose, communicating the business needs to developers in a clear, concise, yet precise way. A lot of rigor, but very little formality. Since user stories are the most common way to express scope of Agile projects, we've added and adapted sizing methods in the Slim Suite to make use of this. You may also have heard the term epic. Look at the three examples on the top of the slide for a second. The first two of them are nice and concrete. While there are details to work out, of course, we all probably have pretty much the same picture about what they mean. But how about plan a trip, which is clearly a pretty important function for a travel site? It's a really big, really vague story. It needs to be broken out into smaller pieces for us to have a shared understanding of what we would expect to be able to do. The term epic was introduced for stories like this. Like the Iliad or the Odyssey, it's too big to understand in one sitting. But there's really a continuum between stories and epics. Like any other expression of requirements, stories are hierarchical. You take a big story and break it down into smaller bites. It's multi-leveled, and the number of levels varies from story to story. While epic versus story may get across this idea that some are bigger than others, you don't just have two levels, and you don't have to give the levels of the hierarchy specific names. Stories break down into smaller stories, which break down into smaller stories, until you're down to the level that you need, down however many levels you need, until you get the detailed understanding. To fit into a single time-box sprint, you need to break down the stories into pretty small developer-sized bites. The piece of a larger story developed in a single sprint may be smaller than the granularity of the story that seems whole to a user. That's okay. The pieces will come together over multiple sprints. One way of capturing the hierarchy that's becoming popular with many Agile teams is called a user story map. Jeff Patton, who's credited with introducing this term to Agile, has recently published a very good book on this topic. But user story maps aren't the only techniques. Other ways of organizing the hierarchy of stories you may hear about includes the technique of minimal marketable features that are described in the book Software by Numbers, which was originally written to understand the economics of a series of releases. Or you can use a traditional requirements hierarchy, and there are several tools that are making a big push in the Agile area for requirements management like that. But however you choose to express the hierarchy, A critical point is that the hierarchy doesn't come fully filled out. It emerges as you think through, discuss, and change the details, going across and down the hierarchy as the project progresses. At any particular time, you may only know some of the upper levels. Levels may be incomplete, have more or less certainty. Deeper levels will be broken out later. At any point, the stories you have in the hierarchy will have widely varying sizes and levels of detail. Before we get into the detail about how to measure your stories to get a total size, let's look at the relation between size as an input to an estimate and duration that's an output. It is not a simple relationship. It seems obvious that the bigger the size of a release, the longer it would take to develop it. But there are several complexities. What team you have to do the development also matters. Consider a bake-off between two teams to develop the same system. One team is more experienced and has a few more people. The other team is smaller with less experience. Of course that matters. The first team will likely complete the system sooner and in the process probably also better. So of course size doesn't determine duration by itself. We'll discuss those issues of effort and productivity in more detail in next month's webinar. But there's even more to the relationship between size and duration that we can talk about today. Consider another bake-off of sorts. This time, keep the team constant, but vary the system. One system is twice the size of another. Will it take the team twice as long to build it? The answer is still no. Certainly, the bigger system will take longer. They have twice as much to accomplish. But you may be surprised to know that it is likely will not take twice as long. The nonlinear relationship means that you can't estimate the duration for each story and just add them up. And it means that the amount of the entire system that you build in a unit of time, perhaps in each sprint, is not the same throughout the project. In terms often used by Agile teams, this means that velocity is not constant and doesn't provide a simple way to determine the duration of a release. So let me tell you a joke. First kid says to the second kid, "What's this?" The second kid says, "I don't know." The first kid then replies, "I don't know either, but here come 5 of them." The moral of that story is sometimes we can know how many we have, even if we don't know what one of them is. And that gives us a perfect introduction to looking at how to measure size of an Agile release. You've probably heard the term story points in an Agile context, and also maybe the much older concept of function points. Both of them are used to measure software size, and they're alike in a key aspect. Like the joke, we can measure the number of function points or the number of story points in a release without having to answer the question, what's a story point or what's a function point? This is unlike other physical units of measure where you have a standard of what one is. But you can still see how many you have without knowing what one is. But there are also some significant differences between function points and story points. The most important is that there are industry-wide standards for counting function points. Given a system scope, 2 certified function point counters will come up with very close measures in function points. There's no such industry-wide standard for story points. Secondly, function points and story points work with very different descriptions of the scope. Story points can be used directly to measure each individual story and then add them up to get the total size. The development teams are probably already doing this counting, and most Agile tooling has support for story point counts. Function point counting breaks down the overall scope in a particular way, and that way is different from the individual user stories. When you need a release level estimate, recall that the user story map will be incomplete. You won't have the detailed lower levels that will be fleshed out sprint by sprint, and different parts of the map may have different degree of detail. You can rate the stories or epics and count the story points at any convenient level that's already in the hierarchy. But be careful. Make sure you don't double count story points by counting both the parent and the children of the user story family tree. To be useful as a size for release estimation, we have to be able to compare the number of story points for the system under development to the story points counted for systems previously developed. The key to this is that different people counting story points at different times need to be consistent with one another, which is sometimes called inter-rater reliability in social science research. That doesn't happen automatically. There are 4 levels at which you might have this normalization or inter-rater reliability. One is within a single team on a single project. As the team members get to know each other and the content of the release, they agree on the rating of story as a number of story points. The second level is that a team that stays together on multiple projects or releases may be consistent in their ratings. The third level is the most important, I think, for our discussion. That's the company level. Stories in different projects in your organization are rated fairly consistently, so the sizes of projects in your company history are useful to compare to the new system. The fourth level is industry-wide. Stories are rated comparably throughout the industry. That fourth level is what the worldwide standard for function point counting accomplishes, but as I mentioned, we don't have such a standard for story point counting. So with this as background, let's compare these 3 techniques that are quite suitable for measuring size of an Agile release. We could measure in function points, we could measure in story points, or we can just count the number of stories. Using function points at the release level provides an industry standard way of measuring size. You have to look at the scope as a whole. You won't measure the function points of a single story, but the way function point counting splits up the scope, you actually capture the effect of shared code better than with other methods. And this is the value of the way of sizing scope and why function point counting has had the success it's had over the years. But it also means that as stories are developed in Agile sprints, as they're developed in sprints, it's difficult to measure function points completed at each sprint because the function points and the function point count isn't directly supported in most Agile development and tracking tools. Carol Deckers has written an interesting article on using function points in Agile projects that you may be interested in. It's in the QSM 2014 Almanac, and you can request this Almanac from the QSM website. There are several other articles there on Agile also. Counting story points fits with what your team is likely doing anyway. Story point counting helps the team make sprint-level decisions, as well as being useful for release estimation, and it fits directly with the way the backlog is specified. It also fits with how Agile development and planning and tracking tools track progress throughout the project. Remember, the measure of progress is working software, so measuring the stories developed and the burn down of the backlog is standard practice on Agile teams. We'll look at this issue of tracking and project control in our next webinar, but there's one serious issue we do have to address now with story point counting. You need to invest the time to develop at least the company level of normalization, that different raters at different times rate stories consistently so that you can use your company history as a way of comparing projects. Some Agile teams measure size by simply counting stories. This is simple, and you don't need to worry about normalization of the unit as much, but it does not take into account the differences in the sizes of stories. You may be lucky, or more likely want to assume that you're going to be lucky, and that the sizes of the stories will average out. But especially early, when few of the stories have been broken down into developer-sized bytes, it's really a pretty large leap of faith. Like with story points, you can count the stories completed at each iteration, and in that case, you'll be counting the relatively same size developer-sized bytes. But then you can't compare that count to the count of the much larger stories that are remaining. In our Slim products, we provide a template that already sets up many of the settings you'll need to estimate Agile projects. It's initially set up to use story points, but you could use any of the ways of measuring we just discussed. The template is a good starting point, but you should plan to customize the template to fit your specific ways of working. We also have a utility specifically for estimating in an Agile environment. This allows you to adjust your estimate based on decisions such as sprint length and adjust some key parameters based on that sprint length. Let me briefly show you now, but we'll go into this in more depth in the next section. So we're looking at a SLIM estimate that was based on our Agile template, and let's take a look at the Agile adjuster. I can open it right from the Tools menu. And in the Agile adjuster, I can pick a sprint length. Right now it's set to 3, and it's telling me that the number of coding iterations for this solution would be 9. But if we wanted to use 2-week sprints, I can just change it to 2, and it recomputes that the number of coding iterations would be 14. So that's not really a change in the duration of the project. I'm just using, if you want to think about it, shorter months, right? So each sprint was shorter, and so the number of shorter sprints is greater to make the same duration. When I save that, it'll actually make some other adjustments to the project that I'll talk about in a minute. But let's take a look at some other things we can do here. So for example, maybe we change the size. We had our release planned for 545 story points. What happens if I double the size? I'll make it 1090. Well, naturally the duration will increase, and let's take another look at the Agile adjuster. Yep, we'll save that change. And the Agile adjuster, with my same 2-week sprints, it remembers the settings that I had, went from 14 up to 19. Notice it was greater, of course, but it wasn't twice as much, because SLIM estimate takes into account the nonlinearity of size versus duration. Let me just cancel that. So let's look at our next section, the shape of the work. This has to take into account that in Agile projects, we use emergent requirements and design. The work to get the requirements right is still of a different nature from coding to test. But in Agile projects, that type of work isn't done as one big upfront phase. It's done throughout the project. That's probably the biggest difference in scheduling waterfall versus Agile projects. In waterfall projects, different types of work happen at different times. In Agile projects, different types of work happen concurrently. This gives rise to another terminology problem. In SLIM estimate, the term phase really refers to the type of work, not when it's done. Phase tuning in SLIM estimate means adjusting the settings to say when these different types of work would be expected. One other type of work we need to consider is story writing, which includes grooming the backlog as well as the conversations among business experts in the development team to flesh out the details. This is sometimes referred to in Agile world as the work of getting to ready. It's a very different type of work to actually build that groomed backlog, the development and test done together. That type of work is often referred to as getting to done. Typically in the waterfall world, these are done sequentially. Get everything ready, then get everything done. There's often a small overlap. You may be able to start development a little bit early while the requirements are just being tidied up. But basically, it's get to ready, then get to done. In an Agile project, it's very different. The work of getting to ready and the work of getting to done are almost concurrent. And the difference from true concurrency is based on the iteration length. There's a period, often called iteration 0, to get fully ready to just enough of the development size bytes you're going to need for the first development iteration. How much needs to be done is based on the iteration length. You need more to get ready for a 4-week iteration than you would for a 2-week iteration. So this iteration 0 may be planned to be, say, the same as the length of a sprint. We'll make iteration 0 literally one iteration length, one sprint length. Most of the work of getting the stories ready is done while the development is going on, always leading just enough to provide good input to the sprint. And finally, there's often a hardening period at the end where there are no new stories. We're just finishing up the coding, testing, and other work needed to actually deliver a release with the stories that have already been gotten to ready. This may be one or more sprints, but again, at each sprint, all along, we had well-tested software. So the amount of time for this end game can be planned to be one or maybe two or several sprint time boxes, but it can be time boxed. In Slim, the Agile adjuster lets you set those phase tuning time boxes. Let me show you. We can see in this chart the overlap of the story writing and the development work. This is Agile, so it's almost a complete overlap. In the Agile adjuster, let me get there. In the Agile adjuster, we've defined the two overlaps. First, we've said in this case that story writing begins, and we can set it to what we want. In this case, say one iteration before development and test begins. That's the time box for iteration 0. And we can say story writing ends. Let's change it to 2. 2 iterations before development and test ends. Right? That's the time box we want for endgame. I'll save that. And that will adjust the durations so that you can see there's a 1 iteration, about half a month, one 2-week iteration, iteration 0 before development begins. And there's a longer 2-week period after story writing ends for the end game. Now, what happens if we change the size of the project again? So let's change from our gold-plated. Remember, we had gold-plated this a lot and doubled the size before. Let's go back to our minimal viable release of 545 story points. That'll shorten the overall duration, but I'll save that. I'll save that. And go to the Agile adjuster again. Again, it remembers our settings. We wanted 2-week sprints with one sprint for iteration 0 and 2 sprints for endgame. And so all I need to do is save that. And it'll adjust it again so that, again, I get precisely 1 iteration for iteration 0 and 2 iterations for endgame. And it adjusts the phase tuning when the work is done to meet that. So we've looked at some key aspects of estimating an Agile project and how they're accommodated in Slim Estimate in the Agile adjuster. Next month, we'll continue this with some other key settings. We'll look at things about productivity, we'll look at things about milestones, and we'll also talk about project control next month. But for now, what we'd like to do is take your questions. As Elizabeth mentioned, you can earn PDUs for this webinar, and you can look it up under this title and this web ID. I'll leave it up there for a few seconds so that you can copy it. But Elizabeth, maybe you can facilitate a question and answer session.
Sure, and just to make everybody aware, we'll have a replay available, so if you came in late or if you want to view something again, I'll send a link to that probably sometime next week, and you'll be able to view the replay of today's presentation. So just to get things started is you talked about different types of work and how they're done concurrently. What about the work of developing the system architecture?
Yeah, how architecture is determined in Agile projects is a really interesting question. Grady Booch, one of the great proponents of software architecture, used to say that the biggest difference of opinion between him and Kent Beck, who's one of the chief Agile, thought of as the inventor of Agile, was the extent to which architecture is planned versus evolved. So there's a controversy, but I think all Agile methodologists would agree that some basic architecture constraints are an input to the coding work, and thus we consider that part of the getting to ready. And I think everybody would also agree that some detailed architecture decisions evolve along with the detailed design as part of getting to done. So it's split. The more complex the project, the more likely you'll probably need strong architectural input to be part of getting to ready and should plan more architectural effort as part of the getting to ready portion. Are there any other questions, Elizabeth?
What version? Yeah, here's another one. What version of SLIM estimate are you using? We can't find the Agile adjuster in 8.0 or 8.2.
Great. So it is available for 8.2. It's available from 8.1 on. It is not available for 8.0, but it's available. It's downloadable from the QSM website. One of the things that was added in at that release was the ability to have extensions on the tools menu. So if you saw when I was using it, there are extra items on the tools menu. Those can be customized in your organization. There's a very powerful feature of extension menu items, and the Agile adjuster is one of them. And so there's a location, and maybe Elizabeth, you can help us find before we finish here today. Remind me how to find the link to where that is. But in the download section on the QSM website, you'll be able to download several utilities, one of which is the Agile adjuster. And if you're using SLIM 8.2, there's a version for that. Are there more questions?
Next question is it accurate to think of the Agile adjuster as an extension of the solution assumptions panel? It applies to only a single SLIM scenario.
Yes, that's exactly right. What it's doing is adjusting the phase tuning, which is on the solution assumptions panel. Let me show you that. So if you go to the solution assumptions, one aspect of the solution assumptions is the phase tuning, and it sets the different percentages. And so you can see that story writing, the overlap between story writing and build is 92%. But if I changed the size and maybe made it, say, I make it a lot bigger to 2,000 story points, and save that, and then use the Agile adjuster again. All right, and all I need to do is open it and save it to readjust. Then if we look at the phase tuning, we'll see that the percentages have changed because the length of one sprint is now a different percentage of the entire duration. So it adjusts the percentages so that it fits the time box based on the total duration. And that's the purpose of the Agile adjuster. And so yes, it does affect just the current solution. And then you could log that solution and create a different solution, use the Agile adjuster, and then log that.
Can you create an Agile estimate using function points as an input?
Sure. As I mentioned, the SLIM suite is very flexible about the method of sizing that you use. So you can choose a sizing unit. This one is set in story points with an appropriate gearing factor. For function points, if I choose function points instead, I might want to choose a different gearing factor, let's say 50. And I'm really getting the same estimate, just expressing the size differently. So if I go to the solution assumptions, that 2,000 story points was rough, was the same size as an 8,000 function, might have been measured as 8,000 if I measured in function points, because the way of doing the counting is different, but you're looking at the same scope. So yes, you can use function points absolutely to measure an Agile project based on the scope, but you have to do the function point count based on the entire scope. So you have to look at the user story map in the shape that it's in, look at the top levels and understand the top level from the top down what the entire scope is, so that you can do the function point counting and find the logical data stores and the logical processes and so on. But yes, absolutely, function points can be used to measure the size of an Agile project.
Any recommendations on approaches to determine the gearing factor of story points?
Ah, what a good question. And we've been doing some research on that, and we've been finding that it's different in different organizations. The best way is to calibrate your own history. There's a couple of reasons why the gearing factor is different from different organizations. One of the simple reasons, so we talked about that company level of normalization. So one of the first things you need to do to get that company level of normalization is to agree on a scale by which you're measuring stories. So some people use story points on a scale from, say, 1 to 10. Other people might have used powers of 2. A small story is 1, 2, 4, or 8, and a larger story is 16, 32 story points. Those will give you very different counts of story points. So the first thing is to settle on a standard way of counting, and what's becoming most common is a scale that Mike Cohn introduced in his book on Agile estimation, where you use what's called Fibonacci series, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, so that when it's going up, it's not going up by quite twice as much. So first settle on the scale, and then you need to practice to get into data reliability. We've been doing this within our own development at QSM, where we'd have different developers rate the stories, and then we discuss whether we had different sizes. In the Agile template, we have we have a size calculator. This is not going to be right now because I changed that function point, changed the function points. But we have a size calculator that you could use to measure things in terms of small, average, and large. We have some recommended gearing factors that are based on the QSM database and also based on some individual research that we've done. But what we found is that you can start with our recommended gearing factors, but you'll need to do your own normalization and see how people within your company rate it. So keeping the history is really important for that.
Andy, you mentioned the the QSM Agile template. Where can users find that, and are there instructions on how to use that?
Sure. So it's delivered with Slim estimates. So I believe since, again, version 8.1 perhaps, I believe that's the version where we first used it. If you're creating a new file, when you say File New, you can choose to import settings from an existing template. And if you browse, by default, you'll get to where the templates were first installed. So that's in My Documents. When you install the Slim Suite, there'll be a folder in My Documents with a subfolder of QSM. I'm using Tools 90 because I'm using a beta version of our next release, but yours might say Tools 8.2, for example. And then there'll be a templates directory underneath that. And in that template, we provide a variety of templates for each of the Slim tools. And so in particular in Slim Estimate, there's an Agile story point estimation template. And you can just open that template and then complete the wizard. So you can go through the quick estimate wizard with that new template. So it's installed with the Slim Suite. Do we have any other questions, Elizabeth?
Should I enter the total story points of the release?
Yes. So that's what we're looking for when you're trying to size a release. If you've measured the backlog in story points, and again, be careful that you don't measure a parent and child stories and count them both, but if you've counted unique stories, then you'll be able to add up those story points, and that would be what you could enter in the, let me go back to where I was, sorry. That would be what you'd enter as the size. So if you had a set of stories, maybe some people do it on a blackboard where they're putting up sticky notes and they're rating each in terms of 1, 3, 5, 8, 13, and so on. you could count up the total story points and just enter that right here. Another way is that we do have a size calculator that would that you can just count. Say we had 15 average stories and 10 large stories, and maybe 3 we haven't broken down yet, so we have 3 epics, and we also have Plan a Trip, which is one gigantic epic, and we can see what that would come out to be, and that comes out to be 20,040 or something like that. So you can use the size calculator to calculate that also, and that'll do the entry for you. And I'm missing something here. Let's put the zeros in. All right, so then I can make that the total size, and it'll enter it for me. So you can either count it separately and enter it, or you can use our size calculator if you have the number of large stories, the number of average stories, and so on. That's a little bit less fine-grained than the story points, but plenty good enough for a release estimate.
Why did you not level load? What's that? Sorry.
I'm sorry, next question?
Yeah. Why did you not level load your build based on the assumption of dedicated development teams? Right.
So I'll give the simple answer, but whoever asked that question, if you'd send me an email, we could have a further conversation about it. The reason we didn't level load the build, the primary reason we didn't level load the build is that the work was split between the 2 types of work, getting to ready and getting to done. And the people that are on the team definitely spend part of their time, spend a significant amount of time, in fact, on work that's getting to ready. So even if the team size stays the same, their work is split out among those 2 kinds of work. And that's the primary reason that we think that it's not level loaded. But as the project progresses, they'll probably spend more time on build and less time on ready, because we're getting down into smaller details that maybe require less lengthy conversations.
If you don't have all the epic size stories broken down into the smaller iteration size stories, can you estimate a release based on a backlog of epics?
Sure, but you still have to give them, you'd have them sized appropriately large, right? So if not all epics will be the same size. That was the purpose of looking at that idea of stories and epics and everything in between. So you can still give the epics a number of story points, but it would be a fairly large number. It might be 60 or 100, or depending on the epic, it might even be 200 story points. Like Plan a Trip, which is gigantic. So if you have the large epics, you can get a size. The less detail you have, the more risk there is in the estimate, which is the same as for any kind of project with any kind of sizing. So if all you know are very high-level epics, you can still use that to get what we call a t-shirt size. That'll tell you, are we talking about a very, very large release, or just a medium-sized release, or maybe we have 4 or 5 epics, but they're pretty small. We see that they're pretty small. So yes, you can use epics as a sizing measure. It's similar to using features as a sizing measure, and SLIM users have been doing that for years. So there are lots of ways of skinning the sizing cat based on how much detail you have at any particular time.
So I think we only have 1 minute left, which is probably time for about one more question. I know we have a couple questions left that we haven't gotten to, but Andy will follow up with you. And please, if you have any additional questions after this presentation, please feel free to contact us and we'll get back to you. And just once again, we will have a replay available, so there's definitely going to be a link to that will be sent out next week. So for our last question, we're using the scaled Agile framework. Where does SLIM fit in with that?
SLIM fits in a few places in SAFE. As I mentioned, SAFE version 3 introduced the first-class notion of release. And that's the level in SAFE that corresponds to the project estimation we've been talking about during this whole webinar. So at the ART level in SAFE, at that middle level in SAFE, you can look at estimating the release. At the portfolio level, the slim, sweetened methods can help you plan the number of teams. Keep in mind at the portfolio level, you have very long-lasting epics that you're aiming for, and you're going to divide those up into what SAFE calls agile release teams. But those agile release teams don't have to all be of the same size. They're made up. Each agile release team is made up of several small agile teams, but you may have 5 agile teams on one agile release team and 10 agile teams on another. How do you know how to allocate those teams? Well, the slim, sweetened tools can give you the kind of duration of effort estimation that you need to help you do that allocation. So it's useful at the portfolio level, and it's very useful at the release for estimating releases that are now a first-class element of SAFE version 3.
Well, thank you, Andy. This has been a great presentation, and thank you, everyone, for all of your great questions today for the Q&A. And stay tuned for future webinars from QSM. We'll have part 2 coming up next month.